as Christians, we bring a certain story, a certain meta narrative to all these other stories that we are engaging, and we should reflect on, as the author, critiquing something about how we understand the world, and is that something that we need to reflect on further? Sometimes I really value a good critique from an outside voice. Posture of faith that is devoid of discipleship, I think that's what they're critiquing, and I just think, wow. Rather than be like, no, this is sacrilegious, this is blasphemous. It's like, how much of Christianity falls into this kind of celebrity, superstar, sort of mindset that they're rightly critical of, that we should be critical of too, that we should be reflective of. How are we falling into this trap? Can't stop being a Christian when we engage pop culture, when we listen to music. We're always a Christian, but that doesn't mean, oh, I need to critique everything, that I hear. That's not what I mean by we never stop being Christian. Right. What I mean is, we are holistic people. We are people who should be thinking integratively about our faith with our lives and our interests and our hobbies and whatever. That rather than compartmentalize these things.
Hello, and welcome to the Upwards podcast. I'm Dan, one of your hosts. I'm here today with John Anthony Dunn, who's an associate professor of Biblical and Theological Studies at Bethel Seminary in the Twin Cities, where he's also the director of the Demon program there. John is a New Testament scholar who's published on all types of topics, including the book of Galatians, the book of Esther, ecclesiology in the early centuries of the church, and much more. And he's also someone who's published widely on popular culture from a Christian perspective, looking at such films and TV shows as Black Mirror and Harry Potter. And as he mentions at the end here, he says some stuff coming out on Stranger Things and Dune and other things that probably many of us are familiar with. So this is a fascinating conversation with a scholar who also is a scholar of the Bible, who's also quite invested in engaging popular culture from a Christian perspective and encouraging Christians to be more thoughtful in how they engage with that culture. So please join this conversation with John Anthony Dunn. All right, welcome back to the Upwards podcast, and excited to be here with John Anthony Dunn. John, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we just met a few weeks ago through a mutual friend, Janine Brown, who teaches with you at Bethel Seminary. And John was nice enough to come to Madison actually for an evening of rollicking fun at a pub where it was a good time. We talked about a number of things, but the primary thing we talked about was the phenomenon of Jesus films. So films and TV shows that focus on the life of Jesus. And that got us talking, and wanted to have John on the podcast to talk about a bigger topic around which Jesus films are a part, which is how Christians should engage with contemporary culture, particularly more popular forms of culture. So before going further on that, though, I thought I'd ask a few questions to you, John, about who you are, what drew you into being interested in these types of topics. First of all, just tell us what do you do at Bethel Seminary in the Twin Cities?
Yeah, so I teach New Testament. I'm an associate professor of New Testament, and I direct the Doctor of Ministry program as well. And it's been 6.5 years.
That's awesome. And so you're primarily responsible, I gather, for New Testament courses. What else do you teach at Bethel?
Yeah, so I teach beginning Greek, intermediate Greek, Greek exegesis, so mostly Greek courses, and then, New Testament survey, exegesis courses, and then electives. And that's really sort of my favorite set of courses to teach, largely because I, connect them to things I'm working on, researching. And so it's been fun to kind of get feedback on things that I'm working on, see how ideas land with students, and develop them further. And so I just use it as a kind of creative outlet, try to teach a fresh new elective every time I offer one. It's a blast.
And so I gather a number of these electives are around, more popular culture, films, TV shows, novels, stuff like that?
A few of them have been, yeah. So I taught one class called Faith, Hope, and Love. And the idea behind that class was, let's talk about these theological virtues and how they are refracted in culture. And so we basically, we had them read a number of theological books on each of those virtues, but also had them, watch certain films or TV shows, particular episodes, and have them do a kind of integrative sort of dialogue between the pop culture that they're engaging and the theological texts that they're reading. How would you sort of bring these two into conversation with each other? And sort of the main thesis of the course is that what we think about faith, hope, and love is much more informed by cultural expressions than biblical affirmations or the Christian tradition, and sort of just kind of tracing that out and fleshing that out a bit. Taught another course on technology, which was a very practical course, but the sort of main impetus for that was a book that I co-edited on the TV show Black Mirror, which is a technological dystopian anthology show on Netflix, and really kind of used that in a similar way as the kind of inroad into the conversation about what should our tech practices and tech habits look like in our technological age.
Yeah, and I'm guessing something like Black Mirror gives you an entryway with students and with readers that if you just did a sort of stale, not stale in a bad way, but just sort of a vanilla engagement with that topic, it would be a different way of doing it than if you had this pretty popular, Netflix series as the entryway. Also, maybe some shared stories that you can draw on to talk about it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a shared text. Text defined broadly, but it's a shared text that we can talk about. One of my favorite writers in the space of technology is a historian at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Yuval Noah Harari, and he says in one of his essays in 21 Lessons for the 21st Century that basically a good science fiction story is worth way more than an article in Science or Nature. And I agree with that in the sense that it's what is going to reach the masses. It's what is going to captivate how people think about artificial intelligence, how people, think about digitally downloading our minds into a kind of digital afterlife. These types of questions that transhumanists and different tech entrepreneurs are dreaming up in Silicon Valley or whatever. Where people are first engaging those ideas is through science fiction, and so being able to incorporate that. And I always bring up, I'm not so interested in whether these things will materialize, whether these things are scientifically, biologically, psychologically, neuroscientifically possible. But why do we want them? Why do we desire them? Why are our habits drawn in these directions? And I think because films and TV shows are so focused on the affective side of our, holistic beings, we're able to have, I think, more interesting conversations than a purely cerebral or intellectual one. And so that was a blast of a course. And it transfers well. I taught it at churches as well. Twice this year at two different churches, multi-week courses where basically Socratic dialogue over a Black Mirror episode with the focus on, because using the mirror metaphor, what is this show reflecting back to us about our tech habits, and how do we want to think critically and self-reflectively about our tech habits in light of what the show kind of exposes.
It sounds a lot like parables to me too.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Those are used even by Jesus in the Bible to get at deeper truths, but through story, as opposed to
100%.
Yeah,
100%. I mean, that's one of the things I try to emphasize, is that one of the benefits of doing this kind of pop cultural engagement is that it's reflected back to us in Scripture. We see stories in Bible. Most of the Bible, genre-wise, is narrative. Jesus uses parables to teach, but also you think about like the prophetic sign acts of the prophets, and even Jesus himself, kind of theatrical performance rather than just a simple message, right? Obviously they had messages, but they also acted out their messages, right? There's a kind of story shape to their message in performance, in the theatrical performance. And so it's reflected back to us in Scripture. We see Scripture doing this sort of thing, using stories for these purposes, and perhaps connecting in ways that a pure message might not. But also, I really think that the more we engage story, because the Bible is suffused with stories, it actually helps us become better readers of Scripture as a result. Michael Heiser, a good UW Madison grad.
That's right. Yeah.
He said once, I heard him say on his Naked Bible podcast, if we read the Bible like it was fiction, or if we read the Bible like we read fiction, we would be better readers of the Bible. And, I totally agree with that. And that he's not denigrating the historicity of it or anything like that. It's just a way, it's an orientation, a posture, a way of reading, types of questions and things that we ask when we read fiction, or the things that we are operating with when we're engaging stories. We need to think about how that transfers over to Scripture, because sometimes there's a disconnect. And I think actually being better readers of fiction can help us be better readers of Scripture. And I think there's just a lot of benefits to that.
Yeah, I do too. It makes me think of also the way that I've really appreciated in my own learning about the Bible, the role of literary scholars and people like Robert Alter way back.
Yes.
Certainly plenty of other ones more recently who bring to the text just a literary sensibility that shows you the way themes and characterization and even particular words really shape meaning in a way that a merely certain one, I'm less informed on those things, so I need someone to at least guide me, but also a more literary approach to the text, which doesn't really hinge on if you think it's inerrant or not. Like that's a different conversation. I think anyone can come to the text and appreciate the deep literary nature of it, and then a lot of the meaning is actually embedded in those thematic and other literary components of the text. And anyway, it's a really, really fruitful way, I think, to engage the Bible. That brings me to ask you, what drew you to study the Bible? What made you interested in making that a big part of your life and your career?
Yeah, well, I mean, the short story is, I was raised in a Christian family. Vegas is home. Grew up in Las Vegas, so I like to say that my sense of what's normal and mundane is calibrated to Vegas. I grew up in a more fundamentalist setting, which is perhaps ironic or strange considering that it's Las Vegas. But there are a lot of Christians here, a lot of churches here, but there's a strong kind of separatist vibe amongst a lot of Christians in Las Vegas, and so I grew up in that sort of milieu where a lot of the pop cultural stuff that we're talking about wasn't on my radar because it was taboo, it was bad, we didn't touch it. But I was interested in the Bible, and I was voracious. I went to a Christian school, so I had Bible courses, and I was really, really into it. But I never thought about it vocationally. Actually, what happened was I was very interested in Mormonism and Mormon theology. There's a lot of Mormons in Las Vegas, and I remember I first read Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults when I was in 7th grade, and the chapter on Mormonism captivated me. And largely because it was like I knew Mormons, right? And so it's like I want to know like what they think and what they believe. And so I just became super fascinated by Mormonism. And when it came time to start thinking about college, I wasn't really interested in the idea because I was a guitar player in a metal band, and that's really all I wanted to do. I wanted to just pursue music. But when I started to think about college, okay, where should I go? I didn't know what I would study, what I would do. So all I really cared about was music. I didn't think about studying music, but I had the idea that maybe I should think about schools in California. I was really passionate about international missions as well, and I found out that Biola had the largest student-run missions organization in the world, and that as part of that, they sent out teams of students to Utah regularly for interfaith dialogue with Mormon faculty and students at BYU and different institutes of religion all around Utah. And I was like, I cannot believe there are other people like me at this school. I need to go to Biola. I had no idea what I wanted to study. I just knew I wanted to be a part of that ministry. And so actually it was the study of Mormon theology that made me want to become a Bible major. And it's just been, nonstop ever since.
That's great. That's a fun story. And I actually have a sister who went to Biola just a few years ago.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And graduated a few years ago. And she was in that same program that's still running now. But she spent some breaks and then actually ended up spending a couple of years in Provo.
Wow. Yeah.
Her time at Biola.
That is fantastic. Yeah. I did that. I spent every summer of my undergrad taking classes at BYU and working at a church out there. So that's a really cool connection.
Yeah. And then another small one is growing up. I grew up in Colorado Springs for a good amount of time, and a lot of Mormons in Colorado as well. And one of my best friends was a Mormon at the time. This was middle school, high school, and just like you, he's very committed, and we got into these debates, theological debates or debates about history and religion. And more than almost anyone at the time, he was spurring me to want to learn more about, like, why did I believe what I believed, and was it actually something I could defend or not? So it's interesting how those interactions and interesting parts of stories that you wouldn't expect are actually contributing to what you end up wanting to make a big part of your life.
Right.
What drew you to the pop culture side of things? So maybe that's embedded in your story as well. But I can imagine there's obviously tons of people who want to study the Bible, and then a smaller number of people who want to get a graduate degree in that study, and then an even smaller number who want to make that their career as a professor. And most New Testament professors don't necessarily also, talk about Black Mirror and Harry Potter and other things. So what made you interested in bridging those two worlds?
Right. Well, it really was, it was actually Harry Potter. But the thing is that I had no interest in stories, really. The reading fiction, because of the fundamentalist context in which I grew up, we didn't read fiction. And if we did, it was not the quote unquote classics. It was stuff that Abeka and, the Bob Jones curriculum and Pensacola, what they drew up. And it was like this box ticking sort of thing where it was not like, we're going to read the classics because these have been handed down to us, and there's this tradition, and we want to know these cultural references and also benefit from them, right? Sort of the practicing of virtue, as like Karen Twella Pryor talks about, or the empathy building, the perspective taking, the catharsis that Aristotle talks about. Like, none of that stuff is really factored in. It's just this sort of box ticking, like, well, students in America take literature courses, so let's write literature for these kids. And it's just, it's garbage, frankly. And I didn't want to read it. And oftentimes I didn't read it. I just tried to guess on the quizzes. Like I was I was an A student, but I was a bad student. You know what I mean? I didn't really care. And so I had no interest, and I have so many gaps in my education as a result. So many classic texts. Everyone's like, "Oh, we read those, junior high." Like, whoa, out of my school, And what happened was, I was about to propose to someone, and bought a ring and everything. I didn't jump the gun. We've been planning it for months, but when it came time to basically propose, she had basically said she didn't want to get married anymore. And so that was really disruptive for me. And this was the summer of 2009. I had just started my master's degree in New Testament. I started a semester early because of my BYU courses. So I graduated early and got to start early on master's in the spring semester of 2009. And that summer, I was a really voracious student. By the time I was in grad school, I think I had become a good student finally, or at least I was aspiring to be a good student. And I really had lofty plans for all the things I wanted to research before the fall semester started, so that I could have more robust research papers, etc. Right? I was that guy. But But I got completely derailed. Like, this was June of 2009. I got completely derailed, lost all focus, all interest. I mean, it was very depressing, right? And the thought of doing any kind of study and even really being prepared by the time the fall semester would start in August, it just seemed like such a distant, thought, really. And what entered my mind was that I should read a story. And I don't know where that came from, because I was not that kind of person. I didn't want to read fiction. I actively said I didn't like fiction. I didn't care for, whenever I heard a recommendation, I was like, no, not into. But I had this overwhelming thought, really, like I should read a story. And I don't know why. And but I knew I didn't want to read a one-off story. I felt like I wanted to read a series. Again, where did this ambition come from? I really don't know. But I was just thinking, like, well, what series would it be? And then all of a sudden, I was just flooded with these memories of recommendations of Harry Potter. And this is 2009. This is 2 years after Deathly Hallows, the last book of the series, came out. I was on BYU's campus when it came out, and I was like, why are all these Mormons so into Harry Potter? Because I didn't realize, how much of a cultural thing it was, like for everyone. It was just like this huge, actually generational thing, right? But it just wasn't on my radar so much because of my background. But I remember how big it was summer of 2009 when that came out. 2007 when that came out. But in 2009, I just all of a sudden was like, you know what? I should read Harry Potter. So I went to the store, I bought the box set, and I read all 7 of them in the next 3 weeks, which I think is quite slow. I would say I'm a slow reader. When I hear people talk about like getting the books at midnight and reading them within a day, like that's like not me. I can't do that. But so I didn't grow up with Harry Potter, but when I read these books in 2009, the thought I had initially, I think, was I needed an escape, right? I need to distract myself. I need to enter into a different world, forget about my concerns and problems. I think that was what my goal was. And I realized after spending a couple of weeks at Hogwarts, right, that what I got was an education, right? I genuinely, like, my whole framework for storytelling, for the benefit and the value of stories completely changed, And if you think about, like, one of the story arcs in Harry Potter is a story of unrequited love, right? The story of Snape. And a lot of people don't like Snape. He's my favorite character. And I think largely because of what I was experiencing at the time. And when Harry says in the epilogue, when Harry says to his son, Albus Severus, he says, you were named after the 2 best headmasters, Hogwarts. I didn't cry when Dobby died. Spoiler alert. That is when, at the very end, in the epilogue, which a lot of people don't like, but I actually think is crucial. But I teared up, and there's such vindication and redemption there, and also I think I just resonated so much with Snape, and so ever since then, I have just become a huge fan of fiction, of storytelling, whether it's in TV shows, films, or fictional books as well. It was a transformational summer in many respects.
That's great, and I can see. So I'm going to flip how we're going to do this a little. So I was going to try to open it up to a much broader discussion of pop culture from a Christian perspective, and then move into an example like Harry Potter. Let's flip that, and let's just keep on Harry Potter for a few minutes.
Yeah.
So, you said you started in this moment of personal crisis to read these books for escape or leisure, but they turned into something more. Do you think being a Christian was any part of that? Was that part of what you were bringing to the text, or I don't know? How do you think about that? Is a Christian reading Harry Potter doing something more? Should they be doing something more than just any other person reading the text?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I always tell, my students or, church groups when I'm talking about these sorts of things is that, we don't stop being a Christian when we pick up a book and read it, or when we flip through Netflix, or when we grab a pint at a pub, right? Like all these things that you sort of think is like a separate space where we like we're code switching or something like that. No, we're still thoroughly Christian, right? When we're reading, when we're watching something, hanging out with friends. And so how to integratively and reflectively maintain that sense of being Christian. I think one of the things is, not being passive when we engage pop culture. I think it's common to sort of kind of go for that escape or entertainment sort of posture towards popular culture. But really, we should be thinking about the arguments that are embedded in the stories, the perspectives of the author. Avoid the kind of flat interpretations that miss what the author is doing with what the author is saying, right? So like what example I often bring up is Hunger Games. I remember one time my mom, she was like, Johnny, why do you like this story about kids killing kids? And I'm like, I'm like, okay, that is such a flat interpretation, right? Because yes, to use speech act theory, that's the locution, right? That's what the story is about at the locutionary level, right? But that's not what the story is about at the illocutionary level. What is the author doing with this story, right? It's a critique of the exploitation of resources, especially in the West, especially in America, relative to the global field, right? It's a dystopian story that is not trying to predict the future, but it is critiquing the present, and there are realities that, we are inhabiting. Like, in America, we are the capital, right? To use the Hunger Games terminology. And so that resistance of a flat interpretation, but reflecting on what the author is doing. I think, as Christians, we bring a certain story, a certain, meta narrative to all these other stories that we are engaging, and we should reflect on, as the author critiquing something about how we understand the world, and is that something that we need to reflect on further? Sometimes I really value a good critique from an outside voice, and try to help my students see the benefit of not, reacting and be like, no, you're wrong, that's not true. Like, but just like, wait, we need to hear this, don't we? I like to do that with going back to Jesus films. I like to do that with Jesus Christ Superstar, right? Because there's so much about that where you could think, oh, this is sacrilegious, it's critical of Jesus, or it's critical of Christianity, and it's like, wait. This is a 1970s story about Christianity in the 1970s. How have they put their finger on something really important about the kind of raw, go Jesus? I think of that song with Simon the Zealot. It's like, hey, Jesus, did you see I waved? I believe in you and God. Tell me that I'm saved. Love me, kiss me, Jesus. Like literally, that's part of the song. And then immediately in the response, Jesus says, basically he says, if you want to live, you have to die. And there's this look on Simon's face, like completely incredulous, after singing this song of like, hey, look, I love you. There's something very critical there about 1970s Christianity and a real kind of posture of faith that is devoid of discipleship, I think. I think that's what they're critiquing. And I just think, wow, rather than be like, no, this is sacrilegious, this is blasphemous. Like, how much of Christianity falls into this kind of celebrity, superstar, sort of mindset that they're rightly critical of, that we should be critical of too, that we should be reflective of how are we falling into this trap. I think that's beautiful. And there are other examples that I could mention as well. A quick one that comes to mind is a song by the band A Perfect Circle. The frontman of Tool, Maynard James Keenan, he has this side project called A Perfect Circle, and they have this song called Talk Talk, and it's all about the mantra thoughts and prayers, right? It's a song about gun violence, and he says the line thoughts and prayers multiple times, and he says adorable, it's like taking a crisis, and then he says, faith without works is dead. Faith without works is dead. And it's it's amazing to me because I had written a blog post several years before the song came out where I took James and I replaced faith with thoughts and prayers. Thoughts and prayers without works is dead. And that was a critique that I was sort of showing, like, this is how vacuous thoughts and prayers is, right? It's like what James is talking about when he's critiquing a certain type of faith, right? And then to see a non-Christian band use scripture to critique, Christian politicians and Christians who, say thoughts and prayers in this kind of knee-jerk reactionary way that is devoid of, action or whatever. Obviously, this is a political topic that is contentious, but it's the kind of thing that is this critical voice from the outside that I just think is so valuable. Like, listen to how they're using scripture. They're putting their finger on something right, and that's good. So for me, we can't stop being a Christian when we engage pop culture, when we listen to music. We're always a Christian, but that doesn't mean, oh, I need to critique everything, that I hear. That's not what I mean by we never stop being Christian. Right. What I mean is, we are holistic people. We are people who should be thinking integratively about our faith with our likes and our interests and our hobbies and whatever, that rather than compartmentalize these things. And I just think, moving away from a passivity is an important part of that.
And I think just it's such a crucial question for Christians, is particularly, maybe not particularly in this age, but we're in a very pluralistic society, so it's a pressing question, is how do you interact with critical voices coming from culture or politics or whatever? And I think so much of it is rooted in what you just said, but also an understanding of the meta narrative that Christians have, right? Like, there's a way where you can critique music or film on pretty direct moralistic grounds. Does this comport to Christian morality or something like that? But that doesn't get at maybe that deeper level question of what is the story this person, this text, this movie is trying to tell, and how does that story line up with the story that as Christians we inhabit as Christians. And what my worry is that many Christians, and I would count myself, I grew up in a similar setting as you, though I don't think as fundamentalistic, maybe a little more on the mainstream evangelical side, but I didn't have the tools to really think of my faith as think of inhabiting a story as part of my faith. I knew a lot of Bible verses. I was a faithful Awanas kid. I had many Bible verses memorized. They were the foundation of my life in a lot of ways. Certainly my sense of right and wrong, my sense of obligation to my family, my community, all come out of that. But if you would have asked me at age 20, even when I was in college, what is the meta narrative? I wouldn't even know probably what that word meant at the time, but what is the story that the Christians tell about the world? I think I would have been able to piece something together, but it wouldn't have been really that robust. And then it wouldn't have been something that I could use to critique in the bigger way, not just criticize, but to critique or engage with other stories out there. And so I would fall often into an evaluation of, well, is this piece of culture something that seems on the surface to support Christian values or not? And that will sort of judge. That'll be the judge of if I engage in this piece of culture or not. But as I've grown in my faith and learned to understand, there's a really distinctive story that Christians tell about where the world comes from, what the world's all about, why people are valuable, why God is who He is, and why He became a human in the form of Jesus and what all that was about. That allows you to then engage other stories that sometimes overlap, often contrast, but provide sort of the necessary fuel and friction for a good analysis, opposed to what you were saying, sort of a simplistic engagement with it.
Totally. Yeah. And another example that I would share is, so oftentimes what we'll want is, explicitly Christian films or explicitly Christian music or something like that. Or if it's not explicitly Christian, does it, as you were kind of saying, does it align with Christian values? So like maybe we really like Les Miserables, because there's some beautiful imagery of redemption and that aligns with Christian values. And that's a great music, right? But a musical that I have a much more robust spiritual response to is Sweeney Todd. And you think about a musical like that and you're like, what? It's so violent and it's gross. It's about cannibalism, right? On the kind of locutionary level, it's about cannibalism. And like, this is so disgusting. But when I, and because I didn't grow up in the kind of, cultured background that I would have liked in terms of like, watching a musical like this properly, I first was exposed to the story through Tim Burton's film, right, with Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter. And when I first watched that film, I was just so overwhelmed. I was like, I want to preach a sermon about this. Like, this is like, because, it's not just does the story cohere with Christian values, there's also an antithetical aspect to storytelling that can be just as valuable. So Sweeney Todd shows us, the twisting, distorting nature of revenge, right? That is a beautiful Christian message, and yet it is not made by Christians. It doesn't quote unquote cohere with Christian values on a locutionary level, but the story fundamentally that it's telling is so like charged with anthropological claims and a antithetical message of this it shows us the opposite of Christian value of the Christian value, and that is the point, right? Like, yes, this is awful. We don't want to be like Sweeney, right? Look at the road that this will take you down. Don't be like Sweeney Todd, So there's this kind of precautionary value that it's not about like, does it just strictly cohere? Another thing I think about is like, you think about anti-heroes, right? They're really big in stories nowadays, right? And some people are concerned, like, wait. This is, we're calling white black and black white, and we're not calling a spade, and we're going to get our morals mixed up because we're rooting for these bad guys or whatever. Look at Breaking Bad. We're not rooting for Walter White, right? We are seeing how pride comes before a fall, right? This is an extended story about greed and pride. We don't need to get into all the details about Breaking Bad, but that's an example of how, yes, he's the protagonist in the sense that we are following his story, but it's a spiral. It's a spiral downward. It's a downfall, right? It's a tragic story, right? And it's not just anti-heroes. We also have stories nowadays that are making villains very sympathetic, and you could similarly be like, whoa. We're sympathizing with bad guys. Like, this is a serious problem. Like, our morals are getting all mixed up. That's not the way I think we should look at it. So an example that comes to mind is Daredevil, the Netflix TV show Daredevil. The way they represent Kingpin is so amazing. I've never been more sympathetic to a villain. I just think that they developed his character so well. And the issue for me is not that, my morals are going to get mixed up now, and I'm going to sympathize with bad guys. No. If I can sympathize with a villain in a TV show, how might that help me sympathize with people I find annoying in my daily life, right? So if I can be sympathetic towards Kingpin, surely I can be sympathetic towards Karen, right? Like, that's that's, I think, the value, right? This kind of, perspective taking and empathy is not that I'm going to get my morals mixed up, but I can have a little bit more grace, for the people I find annoying in my life.
Well, I think this might be one other way Christians should come to these types of cultural productions a little differently than maybe some non-Christians, which is to not fall into, because to not fall into fandom is what I was going to say, to not fall into a way of celebrating, sort of outside the context of even the stories within which these characters appear, just the fact of their existing, and maybe that's too hard. Maybe I don't want to say Christians can't be fans of things, but I think there's a way where the repulsiveness of Sweeney Todd's story can be dulled if you go to the convention where Sweeney Todd is one of the many intellectual properties there, and people are dressed up as him and are just sort of reenacting parts of the story and stuff. That's not doing the same thing, and in fact, that's sort of could be interpreted as like sort of reveling in the very narrative that's supposed to be. And I think maybe that might be the same thing with some of these anti-heroes as well. Is no, narratively, we're not supposed to be rooting for Walter White or Tony Soprano or but functionally, in the culture that is built up around that show, we functionally are rooting for them, or we're even cheering when they get their way in the story, as opposed to the way that narratively they shouldn't. That's actually a tragedy that they're enacting their will. And I think as Christians, you could come a little more. You could have this different set of lenses where you're still able to enjoy the story and even understand why there's fandom around these things, but also to not get caught up in that in a way that becomes the totalizing way you engage with this piece of culture.
Totally. Yeah. The discernment is needed. The kind of discernment, though, that I want to resist is the kind of discernment that I was sort of raised in, which is the kind of plugged in model. Do you know plugged in, that magazine?
I know what
Christians. Okay. Yes. So for
the audience, it's a website that would document sort of blow by blow every cuss word, every sort of every moment of any potential immorality in a movie, and then you go and read it and try to. I would often have to sort of read it out loud to my parents and like try to convince them, and then you're just sort of your gaze just lowers and lowers as you read every instance of the whatever cuss word is in this movie or act of violence. Anyway, that's what it is. It's a website. I don't even know if it's around anymore, but it was very popular in the 90s.
Yeah. Well, and for my engagement with it, it was a friend's mom who subscribed to the magazine. And so whenever we wanted to go see a movie, she would always grab the magazine and she was like, nope, there's a decapitation, 3 F words, and partial male nudity. You can't see it. Right. And it's like, what? Like it was just, it's again, going back to the flat interpretations, right? It's just not thinking at all artistically about filmmaking, right? And so if you're like, for example, if you're going to tell a story about war, right? And let's use like an artistic metaphor. Let's say violence is the color red, right? That's the paint that the artist is using to tell the story. And what do you expect from a war story, right? I like to think of the war film. Was it last year's Oscar season? Was it All Quiet on the Western Front? It was nominated for Best Picture. Fantastic war film. And I think what's so fantastic about it is I don't really love war films, to be clear, but what's so great about it is you just feel how gross and disgusting war is. You don't. There's no like Top Gun, like rah rah, like let's go get them kind of vibe after you watch this film, right? It's about World War I, and about really kind of like the lack of ground that was sort of accrued during that battle, right? Just like basically nobody really made progress, and just the brutality, etc. Right? That the filmmakers, as they use the paint, right, to paint this picture, in their telling of the stories, you feel something in particular that when you watch a film like that. And for me, that's one of my barometers is, do I come away feeling something that the film wants to make me feel? And if so, then that means it's good in the sense that it's accomplishing something. Like I don't like when people say like, oh, it's a sad movie, it's terrible. It's like, no. They want you to feel these feelings. That means it's accomplishing its goal, right? Like I don't know. To me, it's kind of how I approach it in terms of, what is the artist trying to do? How are they using their paint, so to speak? If they're using too much red, right? That can be a problem, to use this metaphor still, right? They're using too much red. That can be a problem, right? Whether that paint analogy applies to the violence or the sexuality or the language or whatever. How are they deploying it, right? And it wouldn't be believable if our villains never did anything bad and didn't talk a certain way. Like there is, I think, an important aspect of being authentic with your story that depending on the genre and depending on the level that you're aiming for, right? If who your audience is, those are important things that the artist, I think, should have the freedom to do. Now, I think as Christians, there is a kind of Romans 14 thing here, right? There's a kind of weaker brother, stronger brother, so to speak, where mileage will vary with each of us, right? Based upon our age, based upon our experiences. And, I always tell people, like, this might not be for you, and don't try to make it for you. So going back to the Black Mirror, the Black Mirror courses that I taught, when we would have these conversations about technology, I would have what I would call the Black Mirror track and the non-Black Mirror track. So instead of watching a Black Mirror episode for X topic, you can watch WALL-E, or you can watch, you name it. Like I'd have different opportunities, different things that students could draw upon, so that I wasn't forcing them to watch something that's, kind of dark and intense, especially if they can't handle or don't want to, engage that sort of stuff. And so, mileage will vary. We can't assume that, these things are for everyone and Christians should just be on board with it for themselves. Like that, I definitely don't think that. I do think that we need to have discernment, and that includes, will this be good for me? And that includes the reflective posture of, how is this affecting, my thoughts, my actions, and my sensitivities, right? And importantly, how is this helping me love God and love others better? That point about loving others, I want to say a little bit about that, because this really is kind of the crux of it for me. Why pop culture? I really love what Cutter Calloway at Fuller Seminary says. He says, film, and I would want to broaden this to pop culture more broadly, but he says that film is the lingua franca of the people. And I just think that's so true. To think about this linguistically, right? It's like, well, if that's the case, right? If this is like the language that we speak, then we got to learn the language. If we want to speak to the culture, we got to know the language that they're speaking, right? And so for me, that's how I approach pop culture. And so, that idea of how is this helping you love God and love others better? What's the pop culture that my family is engaging? I should maybe want to engage that. What's the pop culture that my community, the people that I'm, amongst, or the people that I'm serving, what are they engaging or being engaged by? Like, I should be interested in that. To tell a quick story, one time when I was doing my doctorate in St. Andrews, after seminar, we would all go to a pub, and N.T. Wright was my Dr. Fotter, and he was there, and a handful of other professors from St. Andrews were there, and we were all sitting around, having a pint and a chat. And at one point, we started talking about like pastoral ministry. And people were talking about, kind of qualifications and preparation. And that was just kind of the nature of the kind of collective conversation that we were having. And somehow being a youth pastor kind of came up, and people were talking about like, their thoughts about how you should prepare to be pastor. And I said, if I was a pastor, now this is a dated example, but sort of this can be upgraded. But I said, if I was a pastor and somebody was applying to be a youth pastor, the first question I would ask is, have you read Twilight? And everyone just started laughing because they thought I was joking. Even N.T. Wright, right? He just started laughing. I was like, no, I am serious. If you want to be a youth pastor, again, this is a dated example, upgrade accordingly. If you want to be a youth pastor and you have not read Twilight, or I should say, if you're applying to be a youth pastor and you've not read Twilight, I don't think you're cut out for this job. Like, that's how important I view pop cultural engagement. Like, we're so interested in the context of the Bible. I'm a New Testament professor, very interested in this, right? This is what I think about every day, right? Is the history and culture and linguistics, politics of the Bible. And it's variegated representation of those things across multiple centuries, right? But we need to think just as critically about the context of the people who read the Bible, of the context of the people who are engaging the Bible. And they are in a context, swimming with these pop cultural things all around them. And so for me, it's both. You got to know the context of Scripture and the context of your congregation, the context of your students, the context of your coworkers, et cetera, right? And so that lingua franca thing is so important, and so that's why when I think about how is this helping me love God and love others, right? As a barometer for pop cultural engagement.
You think about any other field, or certainly an academic field, maybe this stretches the youth pastor example a bit, but there's of course key things in any field you go into. Many of them are written, others of them are maybe film or something else, but it would sort of be malpractice not to be familiar with those. If you were, my subfield of American religious history, if you were going into that and you didn't know the top 5 names in the field, and you're like, I've never heard of those people would start wondering, are you really into are you really cut out for this type of job? So that's interesting. I have very young kids, so I'm not clued in on what the Twilight equivalent in 23 is, but
right.
I'm sure there is one. Okay, one more question, and then we'll get to just our final round of shorter questions.
Yeah.
But one other way that Christians might think about engaging with culture. I think here, as you've talked, John, there's been a lot of good insight in trying to get into the mind of the artist, trying to get into the mind of the filmmaker and what they were doing. I can't help think that there's a good chunk of pop culture today where that's always going to be there, because at least right now people are creating all this stuff. I don't even want to go into once AI is doing it, but there's a lot of pop culture that I guess you could try that analysis, but really it's there to produce commerce. It's there to forward the franchise. Totally, it's there to, and it's like and you almost feel like, are we putting too much weight or analysis into this next iteration of the superhero franchise or whatever? And I wonder what you think about that. Like, is there a way to still engage that stuff fruitfully? Is it the lingua franca question? Is it just saying, well, this is what people are watching, so we need to be aware of it? Or is there something else you can glean from that type of pop culture that seems a little more crass and not having the depth that certainly other things do?
Totally. Yeah. So I have probably two things that I would want to say about that. The first thing is that, let me take a genre like horror for a second. So when I was in high school, it's like all me and my friends would do is we'd go see the newest horror film, right? I was very indiscriminate. It's like, oh, this is fun. It's kind of like riding a roller coaster. And I got to a point where I started to realize how formulaic the genre is and how full of tropes and recycled sort of things, and then there's a handful of, horror films that I sort of dubbed the boobs and blood subgenre, right? Where they're not really trying to do anything significant, right? And I have no interest in those. And I started to realize, okay, if these horror films are just trying to scare me or just trying to gross me out, and they're not trying to do anything interesting, and they're not trying to, get me to think, then I have no time. I have no time or interest in them. And so that's one thing that I would say is, for me, another one of my barometers is like, is this interesting? Is it actually interesting? Do I want to talk about this? Will I talk about this with friends and family? That's an important barometer for me. Is this interesting? Does this promote conversation, promote dialogue at all? So that's an important thing. But the other thing that I would want to say, and this does go back to the lingua franca thing, but it develops it just a little bit more. Oftentimes, there is a kind of quasi-religious role that these types of like mega stories play for people. And you think, well, what do you mean? Here's just one example, and it's going back to Harry Potter. So there's this podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, and it's wonderful. And it's produced by, now there's a theologian on the podcast, but it used to just be two students of Harvard Divinity School, or graduates, I should say, who are humanists and non-religious, maybe a bit post-religious for one of the hosts. But the idea is that, they want to have a sacred text in their life. They just don't, because they're not religious. And so they started to think, wait, we actually kind of do have a text that fills that role for us. And it happens to be Harry Potter. And they, in I think their initial episode, they actually reflect on how it's not actually a terribly weird thing to consider when you kind of triangulate a couple of thoughts. And one of the things that they point out is that at Guantanamo Bay, the three most requested books in order were the Bible, the Quran, and Harry Potter. And then when you take a step back and you think about how this is the best-selling book series of all time, right? Over 600 million copies worldwide. When you factor in family copies, library copies, audiobooks, etc., we're talking about potentially 1 billion people read this series. That's wild. That's religious text level importance, right? Like globally, culturally. And so one of the things that I tell people is, it doesn't matter if you think Harry Potter is dumb or uninteresting, right? Like, it's worth engaging because of its global influence, right? That there, I feel compelled to be interested in Harry Potter largely for that, like, alone, putting aside the fact that I actually do love it. But because of its influence, and that's just one example, but I think, we could talk about the Marvel influence, ad nauseum. And I think at thinking of being nauseous, I think there is a bit of a Marvel fatigue, a superhero fatigue, that we're experiencing, kind of like we experienced the zombie fatigue, with all of the zombie media, post Walking Dead and all the spin-offs, the spin-offs within Walking Dead, but also all of the zombie stories that just started emerging like all over on every network. So yeah, I think we're kind of experiencing a Marvel fatigue, but there is something about how, like, phenomenologically, the way we experience these like franchises and stories that is kind of akin to how people engage religious texts or religious stuff. And I think that, like, there's something for us as Christians to step into and probe, and not just to like resist, but because of its influence, I think it's important for us to engage. Now I dislike the crass capitalistic stuff that you were pointing your finger at, just this kind of churning out, sort of unartistic, right? Lacking creativity, sort of. All we're doing is making sequels and recreating old films. We're not. I do gravitate towards certain filmmakers who are auteurs, for this reason. I'll watch some of the silly stuff because I feel like it's, again, this kind of missional sort of impulse that within me, that it matters because it matters to people and people matter to me, right? So it's the same way I think about sports, right? Why do I care if a millionaire caught that ball? Well, I care because the city cares. You know what I mean? So it's about the people. So that's that's for me like what it all boils down to. But I do lament the sort of crass capitalistic sort of machine of Hollywood, and I personally gravitate towards certain filmmakers because they're doing something unique and creative, and that ultimately is what I drive the most enjoyment and find most compelling and interesting. It's the stuff I want to talk about. But yeah,
that makes sense. Just two things in response to that. One is I think of a book recently by the journalist Tara Isabel Burton called Sacred Rights, and she coins a term in there called remixed religions. Her identification of millennial and Gen Z's approach to all types of religious and spiritual matters is that there's a lot of mixing going on. There's a lot of pulling a little from here and pulling a little from there. And she actually has a whole chapter on Harry Potter as one of the texts that there's the sort of extreme examples of people who actually become witches because they want to enact the world of Harry Potter. But in a much, in a much lesser way, tons of people are deriving their moral compasses, their their moral models from the different characters in the Harry Potter world. And actually, seeing them as paragons of good or bad and other things. So that's one thing. And then the other is I recall, I'm pretty sure C.S. Lewis said this, that science fiction is the mythology for the 20th century. And there's something you were saying something similar, which is when in an era that is in some ways secularized, at least we don't invoke the Christian religion in the same way that previous centuries did as sort of the reality, and nor are we pagan, and we don't pray to the pantheon of gods. What fills that vacuum? And what fills that vacuum in the 20th century often is science fiction. It's this utopian technology often works like magic would in fantasy. It just does whatever we need it to do. So I think of that too, and I think many people, I don't know if they think of that in an explicit way, that I am partaking in science fiction to fill the vacuum of the lack of mythology in my life. I don't know if people are doing that, but certainly it's filling a need that used to be filled for many people by a religious mythology that is just no longer there. So
right. I've read a lot of sort of interpretations of Harry Potter and its sort of popularity, right? Because there's a huge question of like, why is this stuff so popular globally? And one take is a kind of re-enchantment, the kind of post-secular re-enchantment of the world, right? And that, just to agree with what you're saying, that there is that kind of sort of longing, it seems, in culture for these types of stories.
Right. Okay. We'll end on two questions. They should be they're sort of just your favorite blank questions. But the first is, do you have any Christian movies or films that you like or that you would recommend to people? And by that I mean the ones that are sort of explicitly coming from a Christian perspective and are maybe even geared toward a Christian eyes. This is often a genre that is derided by those that aren't already sort of bought into it. Much like a Hallmark movie or like genre or something like that. It's like the Christian movie or Christian TV show genre.
Oh, wow. Yeah, what a question. I don't know if I have a quick answer to that. I would probably need to be reminded of some Christian films. I tend to dislike them. I mean, God's Not Dead and these sorts of films I am not a fan of. So I'm just trying to think, okay, is there a Christian film that I appreciate? Wow. They tend to be cheesy, right? They tend to lack artistic vision. And so when I think explicitly Christian perspective, to be honest, I kind of want to say, well, let's talk about Terrence Malick films, which probably aren't what people are thinking of when they think of like, quote unquote, a Christian film. Although my goodness, have you seen A Secret Life A Hidden Life or Tree of Life? My goodness. And he's working on a Jesus film at the moment. Yeah, I am afraid I don't have a quick answer. Maybe I'll punt and say it's got to be a Jesus film. And
recommend to us the best Jesus film. Do you have a top Jesus film?
Well, my favorite Jesus film, and this in order to like explain why, it would take a while. But my favorite Jesus film is the film, I think from 2018, Mary Magdalene, with Rooney Mara, Joaquin Phoenix. It is quite good. And I would have to get into like my whole philosophy of Jesus films and like why I think it's good. I think if you're familiar with the film, you might think to yourself, it's a really boring film, or, oh, Joaquin Phoenix is a weird Jesus. I wasn't into that, or some of these other things. But that film makes me ask questions that I didn't think to ask, and then it brings me back to the text with like fresh thoughts. That's fundamentally why I appreciate that film. It's imaginative, it's speculative. All Jesus films are. All films are interpretative, even the ones that claim to not be, like the quote-unquote Jesus film from 1979 by Christian Sykes. That's the one that's been, globally distributed and translated the most. It's one of my least favorite Jesus films. Could also get into why. Largely because of this lack of awareness, of what it's doing, and claiming that it's not really doing anything but giving you the text of Luke. Oftentimes when we approach Jesus films, there's this idea of like, well, I want a faithful Jesus film, and I just think if you want faithful, read your Bible, right? That's I just think that every film is interpretative. So there's the ones that are more overt about it, and then they're not trying to hide it, and then there's the ones that don't realize that they are hiding the ways that they are being interpretative, like the Jesus film from 1979.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, so I asked you for a recommendation. We ended on an avoiding, but
I know. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
I'll say for me, and maybe I don't know if this is widening the Christian genre too much, but I think there's actually a good amount of children's stuff that is pretty fun, whether it's VeggieTales or one that I really enjoyed, which I haven't gone back to. So I actually, I only have very rose-colored glasses to it. Is a television show called Superbook, where there was like a little group of kids that would get transported back in time to a biblical story and see it from a different perspective. And anyway, I think there's some good stuff in there that I would be totally fine recommending to people. I don't actually consume Christian film myself. Like I don't go out and try to find I know there's God's Not Dead too. I don't play that type of stuff. Yeah. So anyway, okay, there we go. Last question: is there something that you'd recommend from the last year, maybe for Christians to watch that they wouldn't, but it could be for anyone. It doesn't need to be Christian specific, but just something that's been sort of something that you've been ruminating on over this last year.
2023. Obviously, we had the Barbie and Oppenheimer summer, which was amazing. I do love Black Mirror so much, and there was a new season of Black Mirror that came out in June, and I find it quite good. It's very different. If you've never watched Black Mirror, it'd be okay to start with it, but because it's an anthology series, it's not a series that you need to start from the beginning. In fact, I would actually say don't watch the first episode first. You know what I mean when you see it. But it is a really this new season it does some new and interesting things to what is sort of possible within this sort of Black Mirror universe or multiverse or whatever it is. And it kind of breaks its own rules in some interesting ways. And I'm so spoiler adverse that I'm not going to say what that means. But it makes me. I'll say this. Going back to the point about reenchantment, there's a role that technology plays in our lives that is so akin to the supernatural. Like you were talking about the magic technology comparison. There's that famous quote by Bultmann where he says, how can we believe in the spirits of the New Testament in an age where we have electricity and, whatever that quote is, right? But there's something about the supplanting of the supernatural with technology that I think is really interesting to reflect on from a Christian perspective. I mean, the maker the main showrunner and writer of Black Mirror. He's not a Christian, and he says that what Black Mirror is it's Twilight Zone, but take out the supernatural and replace it with technology. And even making a claim like that is so fascinating to think about the role of technology in our lives and how it fills the gaps of the supernatural for a lot of people. And I just, there's a lot there that what this season does that is uncharacteristic of the show. But I think when you reflect on it and what it could be saying about technology, I think it's actually quite fascinating. That's a big answer. I'm sorry, I'm not so spoiler adverse.
I'm sure people appreciate that you didn't get into because there's a lot of twists or surprise endings on that show. So
that's true.
Go in without the spoilers spoiled. John, thank you for your time. Thanks for the conversation. It was really fun to travel through a lot of different texts and properties with you. Any way people can keep in touch with you or follow your musings on these things or other things?
Yeah, well, I'm on social media, but I think primarily I do have a podcast called The Two Cities, and it's a podcast about theology, culture, and discipleship, as we say. And we talk about cultural issues, political issues, theological issues, biblical studies stuff, but we also time and time again will incorporate pop culture. We'll have whole episodes on different pop cultural musing. So whether it's the new season of Black Mirror or the Barbenheimer, Barbie plus Oppenheimer extravaganza, or like Squid Game from a couple summers ago, and just reflect the kind of engagement that we've been talking about today. Sort of just doing it for the benefit of our audience. It's the kind of stuff that I like to write about. In my own scholarship. Whether it's Harry Potter, like we talked about, or Black Mirror. But even I have a couple of pieces coming out on Stranger Things and on Dune as well. So podcast is a way that I get to do that with my friends, and it's a lovely time.
Awesome. All right, we'll put a link in the show notes for The Two Cities.
Great.
John, thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.